Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, September 18th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We have officially turned our sights to Week 4. We have a ton to get into today, but we're going to start with USC going up to Ann Arbor and playing Michigan Wolverines. Going to be a really fun game up there in Ann Arbor, and I want to break it down for you, give you my picks. This is one that I think a lot of people think is a layup. I don't think it's a layup. I think I'll get into that during the first segment, but then we'll get into the couple of ACC games going on this weekend. Georgia Tech heads up to Louisville for a big-time game for the Cardinals, where they kind of really just got to get their season going after a couple of games that were essentially just layups. And then NC State at Clemson is another huge one that has lost a little steam over the last couple of weeks, but definitely is one that will have a ton to do with what the ACC is this upcoming year. Then we'll get to a little bit of an upset watch, a ton of different games that I want to get on y'all's radar, just to watch a little bit more closely, and I'm sure there are others that I did not include in this, but then we'll get into the top 10 teams. What do we need to see from them this upcoming weekend to feel great about them going forward? Obviously, plenty of them that we already feel really good about, but plenty that are playing big-time games or are playing the first big-time game that they've played this year. We're going to see a lot from them this upcoming weekend. And then questions heading into Week 4. We'll continue that today. Might even continue it tomorrow. I'll be totally honest. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat feature at the bottom of the chat. You can see that little dollar sign on the Sports Network channel. You can click on that, add any question, any comment you like, add your name obviously, and then it'll pop up on the screen. And we can have fun back and forth. Very much want to get this to be as interactive as possible, and this is as much y'all's show as it is mine, so definitely want that to be involved, or want y'all to be involved as much as possible. You can still use the GSMCPodcast.net page if that's a little bit easier for you as well. But let's get into this matchup, because this is a weird one. This is one of those that you look at it in the preseason, you have one thought, then you come back to it at the time of the game, you have a totally different thought, and then the preseason thought kind of creeps back in. But let's get into this real quick. But this is one of those games that I just think is so cool. Whenever you get to see those two helmets on the same field, it was the same thing that we got with Texas and Michigan in Week 2. We got those two helmets on the same field, those two programs on the same field. It was always going to be really fun, and it was really fun. Texas did kind of roll them, no doubt about that, but it was a very fun atmosphere, really cool to watch those two teams on the same field, and this is the exact same. Seeing those two helmets, seeing all of it go into it, and having it be a conference matchup is really interesting, and USC is favored by 6 points in this game. Can't imagine there was anyone that had USC pegged at -6 going into the season, but at the end of the day, here we are. USC has played really good football. Michigan has been a little bit all over the place. They are changing quarterbacks to Alex Orji this upcoming weekend, and we'll see what happens there. It's definitely going to be a very interesting change, and I tend to believe it'll help a little bit, but who knows? It's very much up in the air for Michigan right about now. I think this is one of those that if USC wins, they are very much in the conversation to be your Big Ten champion. If Michigan wins, then a lot of things change about the way that we talk about this team moving forward. So a lot on the plate for both these teams, but a couple players to watch as we go into this one. Khalil Mullings has become the running back for Michigan, and a lot of people thought it was going to be Donovan Edwards, including myself, going into this year, but the big thing about Khalil Mullings is he's a bruiser. He is what Blake Corum was a year ago, where if a guy meets him at 2 yards, he's going to end up getting 4 yards. If a guy meets him at 3 yards, he's going to end up getting 5 yards, and that is huge in this game. USC has played really good football up until this point. The reality is, I don't think they've been battered the way that they're probably going to be battered on Saturday, and Khalil Mullings is going to have a lot to do with that. So I think he's one of those guys that just keep running him and see if USC will quit at the end of the day, because this is a bruiser and someone that causes a lot of problems for a lot of defenses, particularly ones like USC that maybe have come quite some way early on, but jury's still out just a little bit on that USC defense, and I'll get into that here in a second. Makari Page has to be huge. Through the first parts of this season, it's been Will Johnson and pretty much everyone else on that back end. Will Johnson has been the only one that has played at an elite level, and they very much need one of those safeties to step up, especially with Rod Moore out. Honestly, if Rod Moore was on that field for Michigan, this is an entirely different defense, but he is not, and Makari Page very much needs to step up. He needs to make sure that he has all of the crossing routes taken care of, because the reality is he's going to see a lot of them. And then helping out and run support is obviously a huge part of this, but you keep that USC passing attack, at least keep a cap on it, you're going to have a shot in this game. Deuce Robinson for USC is a guy that, frankly, I might just be talking this one into existence, if I'm being honest, because this guy is 6'6". He's so athletic, one of those guys that you just love to see the ball in his hand. So I'd love to see him get a lot of targets this weekend. But I do think he caused a lot of problems for Michigan. He's such a long, lengthy receiver, and he's not necessarily the first guy. So it's not necessarily like not Deuce. It's not necessarily like Will Johnson will be lining up in front of him every single time. He'll get a lot of different matchups, and a lot of them will be advantageous for how long, how athletic this kid is. And then Eric Gentry. This feels like an NFL draft game for Eric Gentry. This feels like a game where he's played really good football through the first 2 weeks. He's been one of those stalwarts on that defensive side of the ball. This is the game where you show out. This is the game where all of the scouts are in the stands and you show that you are an NFL level player, and I think he can do it. He's a very talented guy, and he's going to have to be the one that takes a lot of hits from Khalil Mullings throughout this game, so we'll see what he can respond with, and likely the way he responds is the way this entire team responds. But let's talk about how USC can get this one done on Saturday, and the biggest one is coming with confidence, and I don't necessarily think this is going to be a problem, but going into the Ann Arbor, going into the Big House is always going to be a tough thing to do. Even for Texas a couple of weeks ago, who had as much confidence as really anyone in the country that they could pull that off, they probably were going in with a little bit of nerves. You know, it's a big-time stadium, it's a big-time atmosphere, and you got to make sure that you just have a level head about you. You're going in with confidence, you're going in with calmness, and then you just take care of business. So it's kind of that swagger, that energy that you have to bring to a game like this where Michigan is going to try to beat you to death. That's the way that they go about business. That's especially with Alex Orji. That is the way they're going to go about business. You're going to have to be able to play with confidence from the start if you're going to be able to stick in this game, because there's going to be a point where you're going to be a little bruised and you're going to ask, is this really the way we want to go about business? And you're going to have to be able to say yes and keep moving. But the other part of this is give your defense a little bit of time. I know that, USC is one of those teams that's so explosive and wants to get down the field, but the reality is if Michigan can stay on the field offensively, if they can really just lean on this USC defense, I'm having a hard time seeing a world where USC's defense doesn't take at least a little bit of a step back. I don't necessarily think it'll fall off a cliff, but the reality is you get leaned on that many times, and I believe I heard a stat yesterday that USC only has one guy on their two deep that's over 300 pounds on the D-line. That's a big deal, and you have to give those guys time to breathe because they're going to get leaned on. They're going to get beat a little bit in this game, and you're going to have to make sure that when they walk back on that field, they're not still licking their wounds from the last drive. And then finally, force Alex Orji into passing downs. This is probably the biggest layup in the world if you're talking about keys to this game for USC, but the reality is it's not easy to do. You have so many different guys coming at you in the run game, but you're going to have to get at least a couple of these plays. USC's offense should be able to score at least enough, at least get a couple of scores on the board. I think the Michigan defense will play better than they did against Texas, but USC can cause a lot of the same problems that Texas did for Michigan. But overall, I think Michigan has found no consistent passing attack. It's not going to get better moving to Alex Orji. I can almost promise you that. But the run game, I think, will get a ton better, which I think means a lot. But I think it's one of those things that you know what this guy is. You know that he can really hurt you with his legs. Force him into 3rd and 8. Force him into 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10, and then you're likely going to get at least a couple of takeaways, and that's probably all you need if you're USC. And then on the Michigan side, I think use all of the running options you have at your disposal. They have so many different guys that are going to be able to at least wear this USC defense down just a little bit. You got to use them all. You got to make sure Khalil Mullings is the guy out early. He's the one that's bruising these guys early on. And then Donovan Edwards comes in and gashes them for a 20-yard run because they misfit a run. All of this is going to matter so much, and it's going to be a little bit of a chess match, figuring out the way to throw these guys into the mix, the way to utilize these guys throughout the game. But you have to make sure these guys are fresh, because the best way that you're going to be able to go about winning this game is just continue running. USC is going to be one of those teams that you're just going to want to test that defense until they prove you wrong, until they prove that they have actually taken those big-time steps. Continue to test them. So I think run as many people as you can. Obviously, having Alex Orji on the field makes this a lot easier already, but use Samaje Morgan on end arounds. Use a ton of different guys to just make life tough on USC and keep the legs as fresh as possible at that running back position. And then for Michigan, stay disciplined on defense. This is a very, very good USC offense, and we saw it in week 2. There's a lot of things that Texas threw at Michigan that made it just impossible for them to succeed. And you're going to see a lot of the same stuff from USC. Lincoln Riley, obviously an elite play caller just like Steve Sarkisian, and he's going to use a lot of pre-snap motion. He's going to use a lot of different personnel groups, and he's going to use a lot of different concepts. Michigan's going to have to make sure that everything stays in front of them. They're going to have to make sure that they make the right tackle when it's there. And they're going to have to make sure a guy like Jacoby Lane or a guy like Deuce Robinson or one of the other million guys on that USC offense doesn't tear you down the field, because you are not going to be able to keep up in a shootout. That's just the reality of your team. You're going to have to play a rock fight in this game if you really want to win. And then finally, trust your D-line to eat. I think this is something that they struggled with in week 2, and it's a little bit different of a situation. When Texas came in there and they were playing such good football, they obviously had all the wide receivers, and they had the scheme, and they had the quarterback of Quinn Ewers. They had everything going in their direction. What they also had was an offensive line that's one of the best in the country. USC's offensive line is good. I know it's not as good as Texas. You have two of the best interior defensive linemen in the entire country in Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Utilize them. I understand you're going to have to rotate guys in, and the depth is not nearly as strong as it was a year ago. Those two guys have to be huge in this game, because the reality is you're not beating this USC team unless you make them one-dimensional. You are not beating them if they're going to be able to run the ball for 5 yards a clip and then get you on the play-action passing game, because it's going to be exactly what Texas did. They're going to tear you to pieces, and Lincoln Riley's going to walk out there with a huge feather in his cap when it comes to the CFP. So let Kenneth Grant, let Mason Graham get their feet under them, let them dominate these guys, and then when they need a breather, definitely give it to them. But the reality is these guys are going to have to play a lot of snaps on Saturday, and they're going to have to play it against a really good offense, but maybe not against the strongest offensive line that they've faced. So maybe they can get in the backfield a couple of times. Maybe they can slow that USC run game, and then you can maybe slow that USC offense in general. If you can slow that run game pretty much for any of these elite offenses around the country, you're going to have a lot of success stopping them overall. And it's one of those games that you worry about so much. I think it's one of those games that I think USC is probably the better team walking in. I also know what college football is about. I understand that there is something as a wounded dog mode. I understand that Michigan is backed into a corner, and they really got to win this one if they want their season to continue, at least the way that they hoped it would early in the season. There's so much on this game, and I think Michigan has put so much energy, and I do think Alec Dorji gives them at the very least an identity on offense, which is we're going to run through you. I think that means something. Now, the problem is I don't think it quite means enough. I do think USC wins this one 28-24. I fought myself on this one probably 10 ways from Tuesday. It was so tough to pick this game because I think Michigan has a little bit more in the tank than people think. I think they have way more ability on defense than people are giving them credit for. I think their running game is going to be able to get going. I think that offensive line needed time to gel, but is going to be better going forward. I just think USC's offense is too much to deal with. I think that back end is going to have too many questions that they're going to have to answer. I think I'd lean Michigan plus the points, but it's 6, so I wouldn't necessarily lean it too aggressively. This is one of those very weird games, and frankly would not be surprised one way or the other. I am leaning USC right now, but if I watched that game and saw Michigan roll down the field running the ball and just kind of bruise USC to death, wouldn't necessarily be the craziest thing in the world to me either. But I am going with USC here. I do think they'll do enough to spread out that Michigan defense and score enough points, but man, that Michigan team is backed into a corner, and sometimes it's when you play your best football. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we have a couple of ACC matchups to get on y'all's radar. Georgia Tech heads up to Louisville, as well as NC State heading to Clemson for two games that maybe are a little bit more under the radar than they were early on in the season, but definitely are going to have a ton to do with what the ACC is this through the rest of the season. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.